So Glyn, we're talking today about managing liabilities and in particular incentive exercises, ways that the employer can secure the liabilities of the pension scheme at slightly less cost than expected. And maybe you could start by defining how those incentive exercises work.
Well, there's two main types of incentive exercise. The first is for people who've left your employment but are not yet pensioners, so deferred pensioners in the jargon. They are entitled, most of them, to take a transfer out of your scheme whenever they want. That's the law. If you go along to them and say, if you take this money with you now, we'll give you an incentive of some kind, then obviously you get them out of your scheme, you don't have to provide for the liability to them anymore, and in one sense that's a win for the scheme.
So that's a clean transfer out, those members have gone, you don't need to worry about them.
Exactly, yeah. The other type is for people who are pensioners, and maybe in future for people who are coming up to being pensioners. They have a right to a pension which will increase over time, and those increases are built into the scheme rules. Some of them don't have to be there, they're not required by the law, they're just there because the scheme is being more generous than it has to be. And you can go along to the pensioners and say, if you give up some of your future increases that you would have got in years and years' time, we'll give you a bigger pension now. So you have a bigger starting pension, but it doesn't rise as fast. And for some people, that'd be an attractive option.
So maybe now you could come on to talk to me about the Code of Practice that was published in June 2012 and why it was felt necessary to have a code to show everybody how these exercises should be managed.
It's partly politics and partly reality is the answer. The politics of it was that some people were worried about these kinds of exercises. They were worried that they're being oversold, and the Daily Mail had got hold of it. Okay. Steve Webb, towards the end of 2011, as the Pensions Minister, was saying that he was uncomfortable with a number of these exercises and the way they were being promoted. And he wanted to do something about that. So he formed a committee which has produced the code. And that's helpful overall. When I say it's partly politics and partly substance, I mean that there was something in what Steve Webb was worried about. I think at the bottom end of the market, probably the end we don't see with our client base, there were some fairly sharp practices going on.
Can you give me an example?
Well, the biggest example probably was large amounts of cash being offered to people to take not very generous transfer values. So the pressure put on them by having cash in the pocket dangled in front of them now, perhaps at the beginning of December when there's some big bills coming up.
Okay, so the pension scheme will give me money in my pocket if I transfer my pension to another pension scheme. Yeah,
and then
so hard for members to judge that logically over the long-term future.
Exactly, yeah, because they're looking at short-term pressures, and perhaps the transfer values weren't so good, so the pension that they'd be buying in the market outside would be materially lower than the one they're giving up.
So now that the code is there and it sets out what good practice is, how is that going to change the way that these incentive exercises take place?
Well, in most respects, it is a codification of good practice. It's setting out what we would have wanted to see in sensible advice to sensible, decent clients in the first place. So communicate fairly, make sure members understand their options, provide a sensible level of information so that they can make good decisions that suit them.
Give them plenty of time, that sort of thing.
Yeah, not put them under unfair pressure. So that's all in there, and we'd have seen that anyway in well-run arrangements. There's a couple of respects though where the code goes further than even the reputable players in the market were going before. So let's look first at the transfer exercises. I've said that those were sometimes incentivised by cash. The other alternative was you incentivise the person by topping up the transfer value.
So the transfer's higher than it would otherwise be.
Yeah, and they're taking more money to the new pension, and that's a one-off offer, so it's only available under this arrangement. What the code says is that cash is out really. Right. The type of pressure I was describing earlier is deemed to be just too unfair and too impossible to manage in a way that helps people to make sensible decisions for their own long-term future.
Cash today, irresistible, I think, is how people would see it.
So that's gone, and we'll probably come on to talk about the impact of this, but there'll be an impact for that. The other type of change relates to the pensions increase exercise for pensioners. This is an odd one because pension scheme rights are not the sort of thing you normally need to get independent financial advice on. So these were taking place sometimes with no advice being given to the members because it wasn't required by law. Well, the code says it is required by the code. So if you go to a pensioner and say, please give up some of your inflationary increases for the distant future in exchange for a bigger pension now, someone has to advise that pensioner on that deal and tell them, give them a recommendation about it, which is a significant development and will add to the cost. There is a way around that. You can say to the pensioner, this increased pension fully reflects the value of the increases you're giving up. But then if you do that, that kind of defeats the object for the employer because
it's not saving any cost, is it, if you're giving the member the full value? So.
It's partly about saving costs for the employer too. So realistically, there's an extra advice cost built into these arrangements now.
So, but you said that there would be a more significant impact on the enhanced transfer value deals. Can you just explain that a bit more?
Well, experience shows that the cash incentive, the cash in hand now incentive, is a big factor in take-up rates. So where you have a material cash incentive, far more people go for it.
So without cash, does that mean these are dead in the water?
Well, it's going to mean that the cost-benefit analysis you need to do at the outset will come up with some different results in many cases, because these things aren't free to run. There's advisor costs, printing, communication, and if you don't get a decent take-up, that's all been a waste of time. If you get no take-up, obviously every penny you've spent is down the tubes. So you have to have a certain level of take-up to cover the costs of doing it, and I think a lot of cost-benefit analysis will show that it's not worth doing anymore.
What do you think the impact will be in the future, particularly perhaps on the enhanced transfer value exercises?
Well, I suppose you're asking, are they dead in the water? And I mean, no, they're not dead in the water, but I think there's going to be far fewer of them in future. They're going to be more carefully targeted. They perhaps will only relate to certain categories of employee, like perhaps senior people with very big deferred pensions. And the whole approach to how you run them will have to be more carefully considered so that people aren't wasting money doing pointless exercises that don't get taken up.
Okay. Some more thought in advance in the planning stages, perhaps.
Yeah.
So would these exercises be seen as a useful step towards the final winding up of the pension scheme, that securing of liabilities with an insurance company, do you think?
Yeah, well, it has been seen that way, and you can see the logic. I mean, at its simplest, to take an extreme example, which has probably never happened, if you could ship out half of your scheme membership by telling them that right now, if they take a transfer value, you'll increase it by 15%, so they have a bigger pension in some other arrangement, then your pension scheme is half as big. So when you come to wind it up, you've got half the problem you did have. Wind up is a process when you go along to an insurance company and say, can you take all these pension liabilities off me, you pay them in future so I can wind this scheme up. And the insurance company says, yes, I will, the cost will be X. And X is always more than you've got, because insurance companies are in it to make a profit and they're conservative organisations. So they will need more money than the scheme would have reserved. So the buyout cost is always an extra cost. If you halve the number of people you're buying out, then
the differential's halved as well, the size of the cheque that you have to write as an employer.
So on that level, it works. But you've got to go a step beyond that and say, well, but who have you got left? Who will take the transfer and who will stay in the scheme? And the answer is that people logically should stay in the scheme if they think they're going to live a long time, or if they have spouses and other dependents who would get the benefit of the survivors' pensions that traditional final salary schemes do provide.
So if you're not married and you're never going to get married, there's not a lot of point in having a spouse's pension.
Exactly. So those people might go. Also, the people who might leave are the people who are not confident about how long they're going to live for whatever reason. They may have had health problems, they may be very unfit. So if you take a population of people and you strip out the unmarried ones and the people who statistically might die sooner or who believe that about themselves, what you're left with is the married fit people who
with very expensive pensions. Yeah.
And so in the example I gave, it wouldn't be halving your problem. You'd be left with a problem that was half the size but was slightly more expensive proportionately to solve.
Because the insurance company's going to look at this in a very risk-averse way.
Yeah, yeah. So there's a swings and roundabouts thing there, and it's not a legal problem, obviously. It's a fairly complicated actuarial and broking problem, but advice needs to be taken at an early stage on that.
Yeah, it's not a simple answer then.
That's right. I mean, it comes back to what we were saying earlier, that these things are still possible, but the code raises the stakes a bit. It makes sure everything is done properly, and the natural result of that will probably be that everybody does more analysis and takes more care about exactly what propositions they're coming forward with.